The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory stretched like a wound across the American Southwest, raw and bleeding under a sun that showed no mercy. This was the year when the Apache Wars still smoldered in the mountain ranges, when Tombstone was nothing more than a fever dream in Ed Schieffelin's mind, and when the territorial government in Prescott struggled to impose order on a land that had never known it. The desert here didn't forgive, it remembered. Every drop of blood that soaked into its red soil, every bone that bleached white under the relentless sky, every scream that died in the wind became part of something older than the flags that men tried to plant in its sand. Placer Gulch was one of those settlements that shouldn't have existed, but did anyway, defying reason the way a cactus flower defies the drought. It clung to the eastern slope of the Dragoon Mountains, a collection of sun-cracked adobe structures and weathered wood that housed maybe 200 souls on a good day. The town had been born from a silver strike 3 years prior, one of those discoveries that drew men the way carrion draws vultures. The vein had played out within 18 months, but enough people stayed, too stubborn or too broke to leave, scratching out livings from freight hauling, cattle that were more bone than beef, and the occasional prospector still foolish enough to believe the earth had more to give. The town had gone through 4 sheriffs in 2 years. The first had simply vanished one night, his badge found on his desk with no note, no explanation, his horse still in the stable. The second had put a bullet in his own head after 6 months, leaving behind a wife who took the next stage to Tucson and never looked back. The third had lasted only 3 weeks before he gathered his belongings and rode out at dawn, telling the owner of the general store that the town could keep its badge and its troubles. No one blamed any of them. Placer Gulch had a reputation for being difficult, the kind of difficult that settled into your bones like alkali dust and wouldn't wash out. Then came Samuel Corrigan. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in March when the wind was kicking up the dust devils in the street and the temperature was starting to remember what heat felt like after a mild winter. He rode a buckskin mare that had seen better days, and he wore a long coat despite the weather, black fabric that had faded to charcoal in places where the sun had gotten to it. He was a tall man, angular, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than born, all hard planes and sharp edges, his eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and distant, and when he looked at you, there was a quality to his gaze that made most folks uncomfortable, though they couldn't quite say why. Corrigan had been a lawman before. That much was clear from the way he carried himself, the way his hand never strayed far from the colt on his hip. He'd worked in Kansas, in the cattle towns where young men came to prove themselves and mostly just proved they could bleed. He'd worn a badge in New Mexico Territory, in places where the law was more suggestion than rule. He had the look of someone who'd seen things, done things, and carried the weight of them in silence. The town council met him in the back room of the Silver Thread Saloon, 5 men who ran what passed for government in Placer Gulch. There was Henry Blackwood, who owned the general store and most of the freight contracts. There was Dr. Amos Kelso, whose medical degree was suspect, but whose skill with a bone saw was not. There was Father Miguel Sandoval, the Catholic priest who ministered to the Mexican families and anyone else who would listen. There was Cyrus Pemberton, the assayer, whose office sat next to the played-out mine. And there was Jacob Marsh, the saloon keeper, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose past was a subject no one inquired about too closely. They offered Corrigan the job with a desperation they tried to hide and failed. $40 a month, use of the jail building, which had 2 cells and living quarters in the back, and the understanding that his primary duty was to keep things quiet. They didn't need a crusader or a hero. They needed someone who could keep the drunks from killing each other, settle disputes before they turned bloody, and maintain enough order that the freight wagons would keep coming through. Corrigan listened to their offer without speaking, his pale eyes moving from face to face, reading them the way some men read ledgers. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, something seemed to shift in the room. Some quality of the air that made Blackwood shift in his seat, and Marsh reach for his whiskey. "I'll take it," Corrigan said finally, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "But you need to understand something. I do this my way. I don't answer to you. I don't answer to the Territorial governor. I don't answer to anyone except the law itself. You want order, you'll have it, but it'll be on my terms." They agreed because they had no choice, because 3 weeks without a lawman had shown them what Placer Gulch became when left to itself. They pinned the badge on him that afternoon, a tarnished star that had been worn by dead men and cowards, and Corrigan took it without ceremony, fastening it to his vest with hands that didn't shake. The jail building stood at the north end of town, a squat adobe structure with walls 3 feet thick and windows too narrow for a man to squeeze through. The previous sheriffs had left their marks, small traces of occupancy that nobody had bothered to clear away. A shaving mirror with a crack down the middle, a tin cup with coffee stains like rust, a ledger with entries that stopped abruptly mid-page, as though the man writing had simply lost interest in documenting the slow decay of law in a lawless place. Corrigan moved in with minimal possessions: a bedroll, a trunk containing spare clothes and ammunition, a leather-bound book that might have been a Bible but wasn't, its pages filled with handwriting too small to read from a distance. He set up his living quarters with the efficiency of someone accustomed to temporary accommodations, someone who'd learned not to get comfortable anywhere. The first week passed quietly, almost suspiciously so. Corrigan walked the town twice a day, morning and evening, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he moved down the main street. He learned the rhythms of Placer Gulch, the way businesses opened and closed, the patterns of the freight wagons, the comings and goings of the men who still worked the smaller claims in the surrounding hills. He spoke little, acknowledged greetings with a nod, and kept his hand near his gun out of habit rather than expectation. The townspeople watched him the way you watch a new dog, waiting to see if it'll bite or heel. Some of them felt reassured by his presence, the solid reality of a lawman who didn't flinch or make excuses. Others felt something else, an unease they couldn't name, sparked by those pale eyes and the way Corrigan sometimes stopped in the middle of the street, his head tilted slightly, as though listening to something only he could hear. The first incident came on his 8th day. 2 miners, brothers named Caleb and Seth Hutchins, got into a dispute over a claim boundary that escalated into a fist fight outside the assayer's office. By the time Corrigan arrived, Caleb had Seth on the ground and was reaching for a knife. The new sheriff didn't shout or draw his weapon. He simply walked up behind Caleb, caught his wrist in one hand, and twisted it with enough force that the knife dropped into the dust, and Caleb howled. "You're done," Corrigan said, his voice carrying that strange grinding quality. "Both of you, get up, Seth. You're going to shake hands with your brother, settle this like men instead of animals, or you're going to spend 3 days in my jail eating beans and thinking about how stupid you are." They shook hands. They settled their dispute, and they both walked away with the distinct feeling that refusing Corrigan would have been a very bad idea, though neither could have explained exactly why they felt that way. That night, Corrigan sat in his office as the desert darkness pressed against the windows. He'd lit a single kerosene lamp, and its yellow light made shadows dance on the adobe walls like spirits. He was writing in his ledger, documenting the day's events in neat, precise handwriting, when he felt it for the first time. A presence, not physical, not tangible, but undeniable nonetheless, like someone standing just behind him, just out of sight, watching over his shoulder. He stopped writing. His hand moved to his Colt, fingers wrapping around the grip, but he didn't draw. Instead, he turned slowly, deliberately, his pale eyes scanning the empty room. The shadows were just shadows. The corners were just corners. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger, until it felt like the air itself was pressing down on him with the weight of attention. "Who's there?" Corrigan asked, his voice steady despite the crawling sensation on the back of his neck. Silence answered him, but not empty silence, expectant silence, the kind that fills a room when someone has asked a question and the answer is forming, gathering itself like a storm before it breaks. Then, like a whisper scratching at the inside of his skull, he heard it. Thomas Whitlock. The name came from nowhere and everywhere at once, not spoken, but impressed directly into his mind with a clarity that made Corrigan's breath catch. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a memory that wasn't his, a thought that had been placed into his head, fully formed. Corrigan stood slowly, the chair scraping against the packed earth floor. His hand remained on his gun, though he was beginning to realize that bullets would be useless against whatever this was. "Thomas Whitlock," he repeated aloud, testing the name, and the moment he spoke it, he knew with absolute certainty that Thomas Whitlock was dead, knew that Thomas Whitlock had died badly, knew that Thomas Whitlock had something he needed to say. The presence intensified. Corrigan felt it like pressure behind his eyes, like a hand gripping his chest, like ice water running down his spine. And then more words arriving in his mind with that same terrible clarity. "Buried shallow, mile east, red rocks, 5 years gone, need found." The words were simple, fragmented, but their meaning was unmistakable. Somewhere a mile east of town, near Red Rocks, there was a shallow grave. Thomas Whitlock was in it. He'd been there 5 years, and he needed to be found. Corrigan's rational mind, the part of him that dealt in evidence and testimony and things that could be proven, wanted to reject this, wanted to dismiss it as exhaustion or desert fever or some trick of the isolation. But there was another part of him, older and deeper, that recognized truth when it heard it, even when that truth came from impossible sources. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his office, the lamp burning low, while the presence remained with him, patient and persistent. When dawn finally came, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold, Corrigan was still sitting there, his ledger open to a blank page where he'd written a single name in careful letters, Thomas Whitlock. He went to the general store when Blackwood opened. "I need to ask you something," Corrigan said, leaning against the counter with a casualness he didn't feel. "You ever hear of someone named Thomas Whitlock?" Blackwood's face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, recognition, discomfort, before settling on guarded neutrality. "That's a name I haven't heard in a while," he said carefully. "Why are you asking?" "Just something I came across," Corrigan said. "In the records, previous sheriff had made a note." "Who was he?" Blackwood wiped his hands on his apron, a nervous gesture. "Prospector." Came through about 5, maybe 6 years back. He was here for a few weeks, working a claim out east somewhere. Then he just disappeared. Folks figured he moved on. That was before the town had much in the way of law, so nobody really looked into it too hard. Anyone report him missing? Nah. Like I said, men came and went back then. Still do, mostly. You don't ask too many questions about where people go, and they don't ask about where you came from. Corrigan nodded slowly. This claim he was working. East of town? That's what I heard. Somewhere out in the Red Rock country. Never produced anything as far as I know. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. Why the sudden interest in a man who vanished half a decade ago? Call it curiosity, Corrigan said, straightening. Thanks for your time, Henry. He left before Blackwood could press further, but he could feel the store owner's eyes on his back as he walked out into the morning heat. Corrigan saddled his buckskin mare and rode east. The land rose gradually, shifting from sandy flats to broken terrain studded with yucca and creosote bush. The red rocks, Whitlock's voice, spirit, ghost, whatever it was, had mentioned were easy enough to find, a cluster of rust-colored boulders thrust up from the desert floor like broken teeth. They marked the eastern boundary of the area where men had staked claims during the first rush, before the silver veins proved too thin and scattered to justify continued work. He dismounted near the rocks and stood for a moment, letting his gaze sweep across the landscape. The wind was picking up, carrying that peculiar desert smell of dust and dried sage. Somewhere, a raven called, its voice harsh and mocking. Where? Corrigan said aloud, addressing the empty air, feeling foolish but doing it anyway. The answer came immediately, that same scratching impression inside his skull. North shadow, 20 paces, mesquite roots. Corrigan walked to the north side of the red rocks where they cast shade in the morning sun. He paced off 20 steps, his boots crunching on gravel, until he reached a scraggly mesquite tree, its roots twisted and gnarled, reaching down into the hard pan like arthritic fingers. The ground there looked like any other patch of desert, unremarkable, undisturbed. But Corrigan had learned to trust his instincts, and right now, his instincts, along with the impossible voice in his head, were telling him to dig. He'd brought a shovel from the jail. The earth was hard, resistant, and the work was brutal under the climbing sun. Corrigan shed his coat, then his vest, working in his shirt sleeves, sweat darkening the fabric as he drove the shovel down again and again. 18 inches deep, 2 feet, 3 feet. His hands were developing blisters, his back was beginning to ache, and he was starting to wonder if he'd been led on some kind of supernatural wild goose chase when the shovel hit something that wasn't rock or root. He dropped to his knees and used his hands to brush away the remaining dirt. Fabric appeared first. What had once been a shirt, now rotted and stained, then bone. A rib cage partially collapsed. A skull turned slightly to one side, its jaw hanging open in an eternal scream or laugh, impossible to tell which. Thomas Whitlock had to be. The body had been here long enough for the flesh to rot away, for the clothing to decay, for the desert to begin the slow process of reclaiming what had been buried in it. But the skeleton was largely intact, curled on its side in a grave that hadn't been dug deep enough to hide it forever. Corrigan sat back on his heels, breathing hard, staring at the bones. In the back of his mind, he felt something shift, felt the presence that had guided him here settle into a different quality. Not relief exactly. The dead didn't feel relief, but something like acknowledgement, recognition that the first step had been taken. He noticed something else then. The skull bore a fracture, a splintering impact on the left temple that could only have been made by something heavy and violent. This was no death from exposure or accident. This was murder. "Who did this to you?" Corrigan asked quietly, still kneeling beside the grave. The answer came swiftly, laden with something that might have been rage or might have been sorrow or might have been both. His brother, Marcus, took the gold, took everything. Corrigan closed his eyes for a moment, letting the information settle. A brother killing a brother over gold. It was a story as old as Cain and Abel, played out in different variations across every frontier in history, but knowing the story didn't make it any less ugly, any less final. "Is Marcus Whitlock still alive?" he asked. "Yes, close, very close." Corrigan stood, his joints protesting after the digging and kneeling. He looked down at the bones of Thomas Whitlock, at the shallow grave that had hidden a murder for 5 years, and he made a decision. He would see this through, not because the law required it, though it did, not because it was his job, though it was, but because a dead man had asked him a question, and dead men deserved answers just as much as living ones. He covered the grave again, carefully, marking the spot with a cairn of stones so he could find it later. Then he rode back to Placer Gulch with the desert wind at his back and a murder to solve. The next days were strange in ways that Corrigan couldn't quite articulate. The presence stayed with him, constant now, like a shadow that had weight and intention. He felt it when he walked the town, when he sat in his office, when he lay in his bedroll at night, staring at the ceiling. Thomas Whitlock had become his constant companion, silent most of the time, but occasionally offering those scratching impressions, those fragments of information that arrived in Corrigan's mind unbidden. He began to investigate carefully, quietly, asking questions that seemed casual but weren't. He learned that Marcus Whitlock had indeed been in Placer Gulch 6 years ago, that he'd worked claims with his brother for several months before Thomas disappeared. He learned that Marcus had left town shortly after, taking with him what folks said was a decent-sized poke of gold dust, enough to set himself up somewhere more civilized. But here was the thing that made Corrigan's skin prickle. Marcus Whitlock hadn't stayed gone. He'd come back. 3 years ago, he'd returned to Placer Gulch under a different name, with a different history, and he'd been living here ever since, hiding in plain sight among people who'd never looked too closely at his face, never connected him to a prospector who'd vanished half a decade past. The dead man's voice confirmed it one night as Corrigan sat in the Silver Thread Saloon, nursing a whiskey and watching the room. There, corner table, Jacob. Corrigan's gaze shifted to Jacob Marsh, the saloon keeper, the man who poured drinks and ran card games and smiled without warmth. He looked at Marsh's face, really looked past the fuller beard and the sun-weathered skin, and he saw it. The resemblance to the bones he'd found in the desert, the same basic bone structure, the same proportions. Jacob Marsh was Marcus Whitlock, living under a stolen name, profiting from his brother's death. The certainty hit Corrigan like a physical blow. He didn't question it, didn't doubt it. The dead knew things the living couldn't, and Thomas Whitlock had led him to his killer. But knowing wasn't enough. Corrigan needed proof, needed evidence that would stand up in a court of law, assuming he could get Marsh, Whitlock, whoever the hell he was, to trial. A ghost's testimony wouldn't be admissible, and a body buried in the desert, even with a fractured skull, might not be enough to convict without something more concrete. The next morning, Corrigan began his careful dance around Jacob Marsh. He became a regular at the Silver Thread, nursing drinks he barely touched, playing cards with stakes so low they were almost insulting, watching, always watching. Marsh noticed, of course. A man with secrets always notices when someone is paying too much attention. "You've become quite the fixture here, Sheriff," Marsh said one evening, his smile not reaching his eyes as he poured Corrigan another whiskey. "Something particular keeping you interested in my establishment, or do you just enjoy the ambiance?" Corrigan met his gaze without flinching. "Just getting to know the town," he said. "A good lawman knows his people, their habits, their histories." Something flickered across Marsh's face, there and gone so quickly that anyone else might have missed it. But Corrigan saw it. Fear, recognition, calculation. Marsh knew that the sheriff was circling him, even if he didn't know exactly why. Histories can be dangerous things to dig into," Marsh said carefully. "Out here, most folks prefer to leave the past where it belongs, buried." "Some things won't stay buried," Corrigan replied, and he saw Marsh's hand tighten almost imperceptibly on the bottle he was holding. That night, the presence of Thomas Whitlock surged stronger than ever, and Corrigan felt something new, a tide of emotion that wasn't his own. Rage, grief, a desperate hunger for the justice that had been denied for so long. It poured into him like boiling water, and he gasped at the intensity of it, gripping the edge of his desk until his knuckles went white. "Easy," Corrigan whispered to the dead man who shared his skull. "Easy. We'll get him. I promised you justice, and you'll have it. But we have to do this right." The emotions didn't recede so much as they settled, banking like coals that would smolder until they were needed again. Corrigan understood then, perhaps for the first time, the true depth of what Thomas Whitlock had suffered. Not just the physical murder, brutal as that had been, but the betrayal that preceded it. To be killed by your own brother, the person you should have been able to trust above all others, for nothing more than gold and greed. It was a violation that went beyond flesh and bone, that reached into the soul itself. Corrigan spent the next week building his case with methodical precision. He rode out to the abandoned claims where the Whitlock brothers had worked, searching through debris and tailings for anything that might prove useful. He found old tools marked with initials, TW and MW, carved into wooden handles. He found the remnants of their camp, now mostly reclaimed by the desert, but still showing signs of two men who'd lived and worked together before everything fell apart. He talked to everyone who might have known the Whitlock brothers, even peripherally. A freight hauler who'd sold them supplies remembered Marcus as the mean one, always griping about something. A washerwoman recalled Thomas with fondness, said he'd been unfailingly polite, always paid on time, spoke of his brother with loyalty, even when Marcus treated him poorly. The picture that emerged was damning in its consistency. Marcus had been the dominant personality, ambitious and ruthless, while Thomas had been gentler, more honest, more concerned with doing things the right way. It was the eternal dynamic of Cain and Abel played out in 100 variations across human history, always ending the same way, with blood on the ground and a murderer's hands. He continued his investigation carefully, aware now that he was dealing with a man who'd already killed once to keep his secrets. Corrigan dug into property records, talked to old-timers who'd been around during the Silver Rush, pieced together a timeline that showed Jacob Marsh appearing in Placer Gulch just months after Thomas Whitlock vanished, flush with enough capital to buy the silver thread outright. The more he learned, the more the pattern became clear. Marsh had been careful, but not careful enough. He'd changed his appearance somewhat, the fuller beard, the different way of carrying himself, but the bones of his face remained the same. He'd changed his manner of speaking, adopting a more refined accent than the rough prospector's drawl Marcus Whitlock had used, but sometimes When he was tired or drunk, the old speech patterns would slip through. And there were the small things, the details that only someone looking for them would notice. The way Marsh flinched whenever anyone mentioned the old claims to the east. The way he'd steered conversations away from the early days of the settlement, claiming he hadn't arrived until later, though several people now remembered seeing someone who looked like him around the time of the first silver strike. The way he never, ever spoke about family, about where he'd come from, about his life before Placer Gulch. Corrigan documented it all in his ledger, building a case piece by piece, fact by fact, knowing that even if a judge might dismiss some of it as circumstantial, the accumulation of evidence would be overwhelming. But he also knew that getting Marsh to trial might be the hardest part. Men who'd killed once to protect their secrets rarely went peacefully when those secrets were threatened. During this time, the presence of Thomas Whitlock became Corrigan's constant companion in ways that went beyond the occasional whispered guidance. The sheriff would find himself knowing things he had no logical way of knowing, experiencing flashes of memory that belonged to a dead man. He saw, or thought he saw, moments from Thomas's life. A childhood in Pennsylvania, two brothers playing in a creek, their mother calling them in for supper. The journey west, filled with hope and ambition, both brothers convinced they'd make their fortune. The gradual souring of Marcus's disposition as the work proved harder than expected, as the silver veins proved thinner, as the dream of easy wealth receded into the brutal reality of frontier mining. And he saw, with terrible clarity that made him wake, gasping in the night, the moment of murder itself. Thomas, kneeling by the claim, examining a promising seam of ore, excited by what he'd found. Marcus approaching from behind, a rock in his hand, something heavy and brutal, the hesitation that lasted only a heartbeat before greed won out over brotherhood. The impact, the falling, the darkness. These weren't just visions, they were memories. Thomas's memories, bleeding through the connection that had formed between the living sheriff and the dead prospector. Each one left Corrigan shaken, left him feeling less like himself and more like a vessel for someone else's pain and rage and need for justice. He found one old prospector, a man named Dutch Henry, who lived in a shack outside town and made his living selling burro meat to anyone desperate enough to eat it. Dutch Henry had been around during the early days, and he remembered the Whitlock brothers. They worked hard, Dutch Henry said, sitting in the shade of his ramshackle porch, a tin cup of something that might have been coffee or might have been worse in his gnarled hand. Thomas was the honest one, always talking about doing things right, filing proper claims, following the rules. Marcus was different. He had that look, like he was always calculating, always figuring angles. I wasn't surprised when Thomas disappeared. I was surprised Marcus didn't stick around longer to enjoy what he'd taken. "What makes you think he took anything?" Corrigan asked. Dutch Henry spat into the dust. "Because Thomas found color, good color. He showed me a sample once right before he vanished. Said it was from a vein he and Marcus had opened up, said it looked promising. Then Thomas was gone, and Marcus left town with his pockets heavy, and the claim got abandoned. You do the arithmetic, Sheriff." Corrigan did the arithmetic, and it added up to murder. He went back to the gravesite, back to the red rocks and the mesquite tree, and this time he searched more carefully. He found it wedged between two rocks 15 feet from where he'd dug up the body. A small leather pouch, its contents still intact because the desert air had mummified it rather than rotted it. Inside was gold, raw nuggets, and dust. Maybe 3 ounces worth. Not a fortune, but enough. Enough to kill for. Enough to run for. enough to buy a new life and a new name. Corrigan held the pouch in his hand, feeling its weight, and the presence surged around him like a wave. Justice, the voice scraped inside his skull. Promise, justice, I promise, Corrigan said aloud, standing among the red rocks under the merciless sun. I'll see it done. But that night, when Corrigan returned to town, he discovered that justice was going to be more complicated than he'd anticipated, because when he went to the Silver Thread to confront Jacob Marsh to arrest Marcus Whitlock for the murder of his brother, he found the saloon dark and empty, its owner gone. Marsh had run. Somehow, he'd gotten wind that Corrigan was getting close, and he'd done what guilty men do. He'd gathered what he could carry and fled into the desert night. Corrigan stood in the empty saloon, the smell of stale beer and old tobacco smoke hanging in the air, and he felt the presence of Thomas Whitlock intensify until it was almost painful, like a spike being driven through his temples. Find him, the voice demanded. Promise, justice, find. Corrigan closed his eyes, breathing through the pain. I will, he said, but I need your help. I need you to tell me where he's going. The presence pulled back slightly, and for a moment there was something that felt like consideration. Then the voice again, stronger now, more coherent than it had ever been. South, Tucson Road, not alone, took someone. The last part hit Corrigan like a fist. Who did he take? Girl, Blackwood's girl, Elena, 13 summers. He took her. Elena Blackwood was Henry Blackwood's daughter, a quiet girl who helped her father in the store and attended the small school that Father Sandoval ran. Why would Marsh take her? Leverage? Hostage? The implications were dark, and they made Corrigan's blood run cold. He ran to the Blackwood house, a small adobe structure behind the general store, and pounded on the door until Henry answered, his face haggard with fear and exhaustion. She's gone, Blackwood said before Corrigan could ask. Elena! She didn't come home from evening prayers. I've been looking everywhere. I thought maybe she'd wandered off, but it's been hours and she wouldn't. She's not that kind of child. She wouldn't. Jacob Marsh took her, Corrigan said flatly. He's running south toward Tucson and he has your daughter. Blackwood's face went white. Marsh? Why would... Then understanding dawned, followed by horror. Oh God, you have to find her, Sheriff. You have to bring her back. Corrigan was already moving, already planning. Get men together. We're going after them now. Within the hour, a posse had assembled. Corrigan, Blackwood, Dr. Kelso, and 4 other men who could ride and shoot. They took fresh horses, supplies, extra ammunition, and they rode south into darkness with only the stars to guide them. The presence rode with Corrigan, strong now, almost tangible. He could feel Thomas Whitlock's rage, his desperation, his need for this wrong to be righted. And he could feel something else too, something that disturbed him. He could feel Whitlock beginning to bleed into him. That was the only way Corrigan could describe it. The boundaries between where the sheriff's thoughts ended and the ghosts began were starting to blur, to become indistinct. He found himself knowing things he shouldn't know. The exact path Marsh was taking, visible in his mind like a glowing thread. The location of water sources that Marsh would need to reach. The places where the terrain would slow him down. It was as though Thomas Whitlock was feeding him information directly, pouring knowledge into Corrigan's skull. But it came with a cost. Each piece of information, each ghostly guidance took something from Corrigan in return. He could feel it, a slow erosion of self, like rust eating at iron. They rode hard through the night, the horses laboring in the darkness, trusting their riders to steer them true. By dawn, They covered perhaps 20 miles, and the desert was beginning to show signs of passage. Hoof prints in sandy washes, a campfire hastily abandoned, its embers still warm. Marsh was moving fast, but he was traveling with a child who would slow him down. Around mid-morning, Corrigan felt the present surge again, and this time it wasn't a voice but a vision, sharp and clear, imposed over his normal sight. He saw Marsh riding a dark horse, Elena sitting in front of him on the saddle, her face streaked with tears and dust. He saw them stopped in a rocky canyon, Marsh refilling canteens from a seep spring, the girl slumped against a boulder, exhausted. 2 hours ahead, Corrigan told the posse. In a canyon with red walls. There's water there and he'll stop to rest the horse. How do you know that? Dr. Kelso asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Corrigan didn't answer. He just spurred his buckskin forward, and the others followed because they had no choice, because a child's life hung in the balance, and because something in Corrigan's pale eyes suggested that questioning him right now would be a very bad idea. They found the canyon exactly where Corrigan had said it would be, a narrow slash in the earth with walls like dried blood. Corrigan dismounted a quarter-mile from the entrance and proceeded on foot, his Colt drawn, moving with the silent efficiency of someone who'd hunted men before. The posse spread out behind him, less skilled but willing, their faces grim. Blackwood looked like a man barely holding himself together, his hand shaking as he checked his rifle. Marsh was at the spring when they found him, his back to the canyon entrance, focused on his horse. Elena was sitting 10 feet away, her hands tied in front of her, her face pale and frightened. She saw Corrigan first, her eyes widening, but she had the presence of mind to stay silent. "Marcus Whitlock," Corrigan called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. Marsh spun, his hand dropping to his gun, and for a frozen moment, the world held its breath. Then he saw the 7 armed men spread across the canyon entrance, saw that he was trapped, and his face went through a rapid series of expressions: shock, recognition, calculation, and finally something that looked like resignation, mixed with rage. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marsh said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Your real name is Marcus Whitlock," Corrigan said, walking forward slowly, his gun steady. "6 years ago, you murdered your brother Thomas and stole his gold. You came back here under a false name, thought you were safe. You were wrong." "You can't prove any of that," Marsh said, but his hand was still near his gun. "I found your brother's body," Corrigan said. "I found the gold you stashed, and I have testimony that puts you at the scene." "Testimony from who?" "There was no one there. It was just me and—" Marsh stopped, realizing his mistake, and his face hardened. "Doesn't matter. You'll never take me alive." He drew his gun fast, faster than Corrigan expected, and the canyon erupted in gunfire. Marsh got off one shot that whined past Corrigan's ear, and then the sheriff's Colt bucked in his hand. Once, twice, 3 times. The posse was firing too, a ragged volley that echoed like thunder. Marsh staggered backward, red blooms appearing on his chest and shoulder. He tried to raise his gun again, but his strength was leaving him, bleeding out into the canyon floor. He dropped to his knees, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers, and his eyes found Corrigan's across the distance. "How?" Marsh gasped, blood bubbling at his lips. "How did you find—" Thomas's body was hidden. No one knew. Corrigan walked forward until he stood over the dying man. "Your brother told me," he said quietly. "Thomas wanted me to find him. He wanted justice." Marsh's eyes widened, understanding and terror mixing in them. That's not possible." "Nothing's impossible," Corrigan said. "Not out here." Marcus Whitlock died there in the canyon, the desert sun beating down on him, his blood seeping into the same soil that had swallowed his brothers. Dr. Kelso untied Elena and checked her for injuries, finding none beyond exhaustion and fear. Blackwood held his daughter and wept, his whole body shaking with relief. The posse rode back to Placer Gulch with two bodies, Thomas's bones, which they'd retrieved from the desert grave, and Marcus's corpse lashed to his horse. They arrived at dusk, the whole town turning out to see what had happened, to hear the story. Corrigan gave them a version of the truth. He'd found evidence of an old murder, tracked the killer, and brought him to justice. He didn't mention the voice in his head, the presence that had guided him, the ghost who'd spoken through the veil between life and death. They wouldn't have believed him anyway, and maybe that was for the best. Thomas Whitlock was buried properly in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town, with Father Sandoval saying the words and a stone marker that bore his name and the dates as near as anyone could reckon them. The whole town attended, paying respects to a man most of them had never known, honoring a murder victim who'd waited 5 years for someone to care enough to find him. That night, Corrigan sat in his office, the lamp burning low, and he waited. He could still feel the presence, fainter now but still there, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. "Thank you," the voice said, soft as falling dust. "Justice, rest now." "Rest," Corrigan agreed. "You've earned it." The presence began to fade, slowly dissolving like morning mist under the sun. But as it left, Corrigan felt something else happening. The boundaries that had blurred, the erosion of self he'd experienced, they didn't restore. Thomas Whitlock was leaving, but he'd left marks, impressions, pathways in Corrigan's mind that remained open. And through those pathways, others were beginning to come. Over the following weeks, Corrigan discovered the terrible truth of what had happened to him. Thomas Whitlock had been the first, but he wouldn't be the last. The act of answering a dead man's call, of serving as a conduit for ghostly justice, had changed something fundamental in Corrigan's nature. He'd become a beacon, a lighthouse, visible to spirits who had unfinished business, unsolved deaths, questions that the living couldn't or wouldn't answer. They came to him in the night at first, whispers in the darkness, impressions of violence and betrayal, fragments of names and locations. A Mexican trader who'd been murdered for his silver, a cavalry soldier who died of poison and wanted his killer exposed, a woman who'd been thrown down a well and needed her children to know the truth. Corrigan tried to ignore them. He tried to close whatever door Thomas Whitlock had opened, but the dead were persistent, and they had nowhere else to go. They needed him, needed his ability to hear them, to act on their behalf, to be the bridge between their silent graves and the justice they craved. He began to change. The townspeople noticed it. He grew gaunt, his pale eyes sinking deeper in their sockets, taking on a haunted quality that made people uncomfortable. He slept less, ate less, spoke less. He would stand for long minutes in the middle of the street, his head tilted, listening to things no one else could hear. But he solved their cases. That was the thing that kept the town from running him out. Every ghost who came to him brought another mystery, another crime that had gone unpunished, and Corrigan solved them all. He found a killer who'd been living peacefully in Tucson for 3 years. He uncovered a conspiracy that had resulted in 2 stagecoach robberies and 5 deaths. He recovered stolen property, identified remains, brought closure to families who'd been grieving without answers. He became famous in a way, though the fame was uncomfortable. People started calling him the Dead Man Sheriff, the Ghost Talker, the one who could hear what shouldn't be heard. Some folks came to Placer Gulch specifically to seek his help, bearing stories of unsolved deaths and missing persons. Others avoided the town entirely, spooked by the stories of a lawman who conversed with corpses. Corrigan didn't encourage any of it. He did his job methodically, thoroughly, driven by a compulsion he could no longer control. Every ghost that spoke to him took a little more, carved away another piece of his humanity, left him a little more hollow. He could feel himself becoming less like a man and more like something else, a tool, a mechanism, a door through which the dead could reach back into the world of the living. 6 months after he'd found Thomas Whitlock's grave, Dr. Kelso came to his office and spoke plainly, the way doctors sometimes do when they run out of gentle options. "You're dying, Samuel," Kelso said, looking at Corrigan with professional concern mixed with fear. "I don't know exactly what's happening to you, but I can see it. You've lost maybe 30 pounds. You don't sleep more than an hour or two a night. Your pulse is irregular, your breathing is shallow, and there's something in your eyes that frankly scares the hell out of me." "I'm fine," Corrigan said, the lie automatic. "You're not fine. You're being consumed by something, and if you don't stop, if you don't find a way to break free from whatever this is, you'll be dead within a year. Maybe less." Corrigan knew Kelso was right. He could feel the truth of it in his bones, in the increasing weakness of his body, in the way the border between life and death seemed to grow thinner with each passing day. But he also knew he couldn't stop. The dead wouldn't let him stop. They needed him too badly. There was a night, about 8 months after he'd taken the badge, when Corrigan walked out into the desert alone. The moon was nearly full, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow, and the wind carried that timeless desert smell of dust and eternity. He walked to the red rocks where he'd found Thomas Whitlock, and he sat among them, feeling the stone still warm from the day's heat against his back. The voices were always with him now, a constant murmur in the back of his mind, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. The accumulated dead of a violent frontier, all clamoring for attention, for justice, for someone to finally hear them. "I'm sorry," Corrigan said to the empty desert, to the stars, to the ghosts that crowded his thoughts. "I'm sorry I can't help all of you. I'm sorry I'm not strong enough." The voices quieted just for a moment, and in that brief silence, he heard Thomas Whitlock's voice one last time, clearer than it had been since the day Marsh died. "You did enough," Whitlock said. "You gave me justice. You gave others justice, but you're not meant to carry all of us. The dead are meant to stay dead, Samuel. We had our time. This is yours. Let us go." "I don't know how," Corrigan admitted, and it was the truest thing he'd said in months. "Close the door you opened. Stop listening. It'll hurt, but you'll survive. You're strong enough. You've always been strong enough." Corrigan sat there for a long time, wrestling with himself, with the voices, with the terrible purpose that had defined him since the day Thomas Whitlock had first spoken his name. Finally, as dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold, he made his choice. He stood, his joints protesting, and he spoke with all the authority he'd once used to impose law on a lawless town. "No more," he said to the voices, to the dead, to the open door in his mind. "I hear you. I acknowledge you, but I can't carry you anymore. Find your rest. Find your peace, but find it somewhere else." The voices rose in protest, a cacophony of desperate pleas and angry demands, but Corrigan held firm. He felt the door in his mind, the pathway the ghosts used to reach him, and with an effort that nearly broke him, he began to close it. It wasn't physical, this door, but it required physical will, a determination that came from somewhere deep and primal. The voices grew fainter, more distant, like a train pulling away from a station. Some of them raged against the closing, trying to force their way through before it was too late. Others seemed to accept it, their whispers fading into something that might have been gratitude or might have been resignation. And finally, mercifully, there was silence, real silence, the kind Corrigan hadn't experienced in months, where his thoughts were his own and his head belonged only to himself. He collapsed to his knees in the dust, gasping, shaking, feeling like he'd just run 100 miles uphill. But he was alone in his own mind for the first time since Thomas Whitlock had spoken that name, and the relief was so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Corrigan returned to Placer Gulch as the sun was fully risen, and he went to his office, and he slept for 16 hours straight, the sleep of the truly exhausted. When he woke, he wrote a letter to the Territorial governor, resigning his position as sheriff of Placer Gulch. He'd done what he came to do, and more besides, but the cost had been too high, and he knew that if he stayed, the door might open again, and next time, he might not be strong enough to close it. He left the next morning, riding his buckskin mare south toward Tucson, then beyond. The townspeople came out to watch him go, some with gratitude, some with relief, all with a kind of awe reserved for people who've touched something beyond normal understanding. Henry Blackwood, whose daughter Corrigan had saved, shook his hand and pressed a small bag of silver into his palm. "For the road," Blackwood said, "and thank you for everything." Corrigan took it, nodded, and rode out without looking back. History doesn't remember Samuel Corrigan well. He's a footnote in Territorial records, a sheriff who served for less than a year before resigning for health reasons. There are no monuments to him, no streets bearing his name, no legends passed down through generations. But in Placer Gulch, which is itself now just a ghost town, bones and ruins slowly being reclaimed by the desert, there are still whispers. Old-timers who heard the stories from their grandparents will tell you about the dead man's sheriff, the one who could hear the voices of the murdered and the lost, the one who solved cases that should have stayed unsolved forever. They say he rode into the deep desert after leaving Placer Gulch, seeking isolation, trying to outrun the voices that still occasionally whispered at the edges of his mind. They say he lived for many more years, growing old in solitude, a hermit who helped passing travelers when they needed it and avoided towns and people whenever possible. They say that when he finally died, alone in a cabin somewhere in the Sonoran wilderness, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath for a moment, as though the land was acknowledging the passing of someone who'd served as a bridge between its living and its dead. And they say, though this part is probably just legend piled on legend, that on certain nights when the wind is right and the moon is dark, you can still hear him out there in the red rock country. Not his voice exactly, but the sound of questions being asked in the darkness. Questions that only the dead can answer. Questions that a tired sheriff once carried on their behalf at a cost no living man should have to pay. The Arizona Territory is quiet now, subdued under the weight of cities and highways and the march of time. But the desert remembers. It always remembers. And deep in the places where the old stones still stand and the wind still whispers stories, the dead still have things to say. They just don't have anyone left to hear them. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Samuel Corrigan crossed one anyway, and he paid the price that all such crossings demand. He found justice for the murdered and the forgotten. He gave voice to the voiceless and brought peace to the restless. But in the end, he learned what the desert had always known. The dead should stay dead. The living should stay living. And the line between those two states exists for a reason, drawn in blood and dust and the accumulated weight of every soul that's ever passed from one side to the other. Corrigan understood this truth too late to save himself from the cost of crossing that line, but he understood it in time to step back, to close the door he'd opened, to choose life over the seductive pull of being useful to the dead. That was his final act of courage, more difficult than facing down gunmen or solving impossible murders or listening to the whispered agonies of restless spirits. He chose to be just a man again, mortal and limited and gloriously, terrifyingly alone in his own head. And in making that choice, he saved himself. Not completely, not perfectly. The scars remained, the memories of voices that shouldn't exist, the knowledge of things that living men aren't meant to know. But he survived, and sometimes survival is the only victory that matters. The sheriff's office in Placer Gulch went through 3 more occupants after Corrigan left. Then the town dried up completely, the last residents moving on to places with better water and brighter prospects. The building still stands, or what's left of it, adobe walls slowly melting back into the earth, roof timbers exposed like ribs. Sometimes people visit ghost towns like Placer Gulch, tourists and historians and photographers drawn by the romance of ruins. They walk through the empty streets, snap pictures of the weathered wood and crumbling adobe. Imagine what life must have been like in these forgotten places. Very few of them go to the cemetery on the hill. Fewer still notice the simple marker that bears the name Thomas Whitlock and dates that span only 26 years of life. And none of them, absolutely none, can hear the satisfaction in the silence around that grave, the peace of a man who suffered injustice but finally found someone who cared enough to make it right. That's what Samuel Corrigan gave him. That's what the dead man's sheriff provided for dozens of forgotten victims scattered across the territorial Southwest. Not resurrection, not another chance at life, but something arguably more valuable: acknowledgement, justice, the simple truth that their deaths mattered, that someone would stand for them, that the crimes committed against them wouldn't be allowed to simply fade into the past unmarked and unpunished. It cost Corrigan everything he had and nearly killed him in the process. But he did it anyway because when the dead asked him questions, he couldn't help but answer. It was his nature, his curse, and ultimately his redemption. The sun sets on the Arizona Territory now the same way it did in 1878, painting the desert in shades of gold and blood and shadow. The land doesn't change, not really. It simply waits, patient and timeless, knowing that new stories will come even as old ones fade. But somewhere in the records of territorial law enforcement, somewhere in the fading memories of old families, somewhere in the whispered legends that persist even when the facts are long forgotten, Samuel Corrigan remains. The sheriff who answered questions only the dead could ask. The man who stood at the threshold between worlds and chose to serve both until the cost became too high to bear. His story is nearly forgotten now, another ghost story from a land that has more ghosts than it knows what to do with. But some stories refuse to die completely. They linger in the margins, waiting for someone who will listen, who will care, who will keep them alive just a little longer. Just like the dead once waited for someone who would hear them, these stories wait for someone who will remember them. And in the remembering, Perhaps there's a kind of immortality after all. Not the immortality of heaven or hell, but the immortality of being known, being recorded, being part of the long and bloody and beautiful narrative of human existence. Samuel Corrigan served his purpose. He answered the questions that needed answering, paid the price that needed paying, and walked away before the work destroyed him completely. In doing so, he joined the ranks of flawed heroes who populate every frontier, every transition, every thin place where civilization tries to impose itself on wildness. He was neither saint nor villain, neither pure nor corrupt. He was simply a man who heard voices he shouldn't have been able to hear and decided to do something about it. Consequences be damned. That's enough for any epitaph. That's enough for any legend. That's enough to ensure that when people speak of the old territorial days, when they tell tales of sheriffs and outlaws and the violent birth of law in lawless places, his name will occasionally surface, wrapped in mystery and wonder and the uneasy recognition that some truths are stranger than any fiction. The dead have their voices. Samuel Corrigan gave them that, and in return, they gave him a story that refuses to die, a legacy built on whispered questions and impossible answers, a monument made not of stone, but of memory and myth, and the enduring power of a man who refused to let murder go unanswered, even when the witnesses were all in their graves. That's the story of the sheriff who answered questions only the dead could ask. It's a story of justice and madness, of courage and cost, of the price we pay for doing what's right, even when what's right shouldn't be possible. It's a story the Arizona desert remembers, carved into its red rocks and whispered on its winds, preserved in the silence of abandoned towns and the shadows of empty buildings where lawmen once sat and listened to voices that shouldn't exist. And like all the best stories from the frontier, it's probably at least partly true, which makes it infinitely more terrifying than any pure fiction ever could be.